Okay, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome back. We jump straight into this afternoon's first session. As you would see from the slide that's indicated, it's the historicity of Jesus. And one of the questions that are going to be answered, or what we're going to attempt to address, are really three main issues. Did Jesus really exist? It's something that we may take for granted. I was having a conversation during the lunch break, in the conversation, just realizing that sometimes, because of the environment in which we've grown up or where we were born, many of us are fortunate to have some understanding of issues of faith. But that's not everyone's experience. So what we may take for granted, that it's a fact that Jesus lived, for many of us, we believe that because we grew up hearing that. Yeah. And so we don't believe anything else because that's what we grew up believing. But what happens to the person who did not grow up in the environment in which many of us did? It's not taken for granted. Did the resurrection actually take place? But that too may seem like almost a rhetorical question. That issue is hotly debated these days. And there are many articles and many books that are being written to counteract the truth of Jesus' resurrection. And I do hope that this presentation, together with what will follow from Paulo, would help us. And again, even the debate that some of us may have looked at, I think it was a great discussion of that issue. What does the historical record show? So these are the three questions we aim to address in the next 75 minutes or so. Let's proceed. All right, I have indicated some of the core text. I'm not sure if I would not have referred to this morning to Strobel's own, the case for Christ. He has quite a series. He has the case for Easter, the case for the resurrection. All right, and this is an investigative journalist with a legal background who used to work for the Chicago Tribune, and he brought his legal background into his investigation of this question. And I think it's a very well-written book. And many of his works tend to be very well-written and good reading. The value of evidence. Some of the questions that have to be asked. Has the collection of evidence really been thorough? If one person says something and really, really believes it, is that sufficient evidence? Which explanation best fits the totality of the facts? It's one of the questions that Strobel asks. All right? When you look at all of the facts that are before you, there may be various options, various explanations. The debate between Licona and Irwin is a classic example. They have both done research, and yet they come to different conclusions. And so one of the questions we ask when dealing with matters of evidence, what explanation best fits the totality of the facts? And I mentioned a little bit earlier, an argument without evidence is merely an assertion, it's just an opinion. And as you prepare yourself with humility, with gentleness, and with respect to answer questions, one of the things you would want to be equipped and ready to ask is, what's your proof for that particular assertion? If you can't substantiate it, I am under no obligation to believe what you just said. And the same thing could be said to us. So we can't say, well, just believe in the Bible because I like it, it reads well. No. All right, we have to go deeper than that.
Yeah.
Strobel goes through many different types of evidence. Any law students here, by the way? Well, no, you wouldn't. Would you? Is law in the university? Not yet. You'd have to get into law school afterwards. Forgive me. All right, but maybe if you had any kind of introduction to law, the different types of evidence, maybe something that's familiar. Eyewitness evidence, probably the most cogent, because the eyewitness evidence is the story of the person who's actually seen it.
Yeah.
So when I can tell somebody about the University of Maryland, if I hear somebody saying the University of Maryland is very, very small, I can probably house only 100 students, I'd say that's a lie. I was there. The thing is massive. It's huge. The campus can't finish. You know what I mean? It is like I was saying to Paula as we drove in, all of this is the university. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. This is an absolutely beautiful institution. Documentary evidence deals with the issue of its preservation. And of course, because we dealt with that in some detail earlier this morning, I'm not going to spend much time on that. Corroborating evidence. Something that corroborates is something that confirms. All right? And so we look at, is there evidence outside of the Gospels? Scientific evidence, the role of archaeology. Rebuttal evidence, very important. And with the workshops this afternoon, we will deal a little bit more with the issue of rebutting. How do you refute, a particular claim? How do you, come up with a different position to be able to show that, okay, the view that you hold is not necessarily the only view. So this is not an exhaustive list, but this is what I've chosen to concentrate on for our purposes. Did Jesus exist? Honest and accurate testimony will withstand scrutiny. So that assumes the fact that there will be scrutiny of testimony. And that's a good thing. When our positions, when our worldviews are scrutinized, it's a good thing. One of the things I was confessing to Paolo as we spoke last night over dinner is that I have not personally spent enough time reading what my opponents believe. And I remember a couple of years ago, there's just so many things to read. I haven't been able to read that book yet, but I'd gotten a gift certificate for my birthday, and I was going to buy a book with it, because the certificate was for a bookstore. And I was about to buy a particular book, and it just so happened that I struck up a conversation with someone who was an atheist. And he told me about some of his beliefs and some of the authors. And based on that conversation, I used my certificate to buy a book written by an atheist. Because I thought to myself, I have not spent enough time reading what my opponents believe. And so I really ran the risk of being very skewed and unbalanced in my assessment of particular things. And so Paolo was able to help me with that, because he himself mentioned a lot of his books have to deal with people who hold positions different from him. That's a healthy thing. Right? Honest and accurate testimony will withstand scrutiny, while false, exaggerated or misleading testimony will be exposed. When scrutinized, testimony will stand up for what it's really worth. So the question we're asking, are the gospel accounts reliable as eyewitness evidence for Jesus' existence? And one of the questions, Greg, was it you had asked the question about, was it you had asked the question before lunch about the date of writing of the Gospels? And that's something that we will talk about. Anybody knows how close to the actual events that the Gospels were written?
50 years.
It's about 30 years apart, 30, 40 years, about a full generation, all right, or thereabouts. And that's one of the issues that Urban raises in the debates. Okay, but even before we get to the dating of the events, what we're actually looking at is the reliability of the gospel accounts as eyewitness evidence. Now, what we're trying to get at, if somehow we could get before us people who saw Jesus, who walked with him, who listened to him, who saw him in his ministry, then we're in a great situation, because we will be getting the viewpoint or the account of someone who was actually there. And that's what we're trying to see, how reliable are the gospel accounts where that is concerned, as an eyewitness account. Just a quick note, as I made the point, the New Testament is not written chronologically. So even though the New Testament starts with the Gospels, Paul's letters actually precede the Gospels. Okay? Paul's letters, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, Galatians likely was the first one written as early as 48 or so AD. Alright, so very good book written by Paul Barnett, older publication, I think 1986 or so, is the New Testament history. And he asks, how can we know that what we read of Jesus is a true account? How confident may we be that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have told us the truth about Jesus, and not given us some idealized romantic version? Alright? How do we know? Can we trust these guys with what we said? One of the first things I have to admit, the authors of the Gospels, the names strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous. It's very different from the epistles. You read the epistles and you go to chapter 1, verse 1 of the various letters, and you, for the most part, get to see who wrote it. Whether it was, Paul who wrote it, or, Paul together with Sosthenes, or whoever it might have been. With the Gospels, it's not said. So we actually have to rely on early historical accounts, and there is general agreement that the names that we have come to know as the authors are indeed the authors. I just wanted to make the point that that's not a given. Okay, because you don't see Matthew chapter 1 verse 1, I Matthew,
Right.
all right, or I Mark, or I Luke. So that is not a foregone conclusion, but there's not too much disagreement in terms of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the authors of the gospel accounts. Barnett in that same book notes 3 areas where there's general agreement among scholars. That one, Mark was written before Matthew and Luke. That Matthew and Luke broadly follows Mark's sequence and incorporate Markan material into their Gospels. And John's outline of events does not easily dovetail with Mark's or vice versa. And there was a question I got from, is it Kiara?
Yes.
Yeah, there was a question I got from Kiara where I started to talk about the difference between the synoptics and John. So there's some general agreement among scholars that, hey, this is the position. Mark was written first, Matthew and Luke used a lot of Mark and incorporated that. John, very, very different. All right, and the details don't necessarily dovetail with one another. Strobel notes that because of similarities in language and content, it has traditionally been assumed that Matthew and Luke draw upon Mark's earlier gospel in writing their own. In addition, scholars have said that Matthew and Luke also incorporated some material from this mysterious Q, material that is absent from Mark. There's this Q, is short for a word spelled Q-U-E-L-L-E. It's a German word that means source. And there's again a general agreement that in addition to Mark being a source for Matthew and Luke, that there's this independent source called Q. All right, from that, like I said, from the German word meaning source that they relied on. And Q, all right, the material taken from Q is material that is in Matthew and Luke, but is not in Mark. There aren't many things, by the way, which are in all of the Gospels. Anybody could think of, I can think of 2. All right, 2 things that are in all 4. William? So, Jesus feeding the 5,000, that's in all 4. All right, and what else? And probably, maybe the more obvious one.
Crucifixion.
His crucifixion. All right, those 2. I'm really not sure if there's anything else. They might be. Those are the 2 more obvious ones. But most of the other stuff, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, quite a lot in common. John, very different. Let's first of all talk about Mark and John as witnesses. Because we're dealing with the eyewitness evidence side of things. The viewpoint of, I have seen with my own eyes. Look at what John says in John 19. I'm using the English Standard Version. And just after the account of Jesus having because the legs were broken for the criminals that were crucified with him. And then, the Bible says in John chapter 19 that Jesus, they realized that he was already what? He was already dead. And then the Bible speaks about him being pierced in his side with a spear. And right after that, John is saying, he who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth, that you may also believe. So John is making a very clear statement. I saw it. What I'm saying is true. I have borne witness. And then he reinforces that at the end of John, in chapter 21, verse 24, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there's a funny exchange between Jesus and Peter. And John was referred to as what? The disciple whom?
Loved us.
Yeah, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And there's this discussion with Peter and John, and and maybe amongst the disciples, a little rumor started. Well, John was going to die, because when Peter asked, "So what about this guy? The disciple who Jesus loves?" Well, Jesus, pretty much says that's not your business. All right, what is that to you? You know? So John is making a very clear statement that he personally bore witness. I was there, I was alive, all right, especially in that period of the crucifixion. In terms of Mark, what's a little bit interesting with Mark is that Mark pretty much relies on Peter. The scholars say Mark actually wrote the Gospel of Mark in collaboration with Peter. Some say he relied on information supplied by Peter. Now, Jesus had a circle of an inner three. Who were those three? Peter, James, and John. Okay, we were just talking about John, one of the inner three. And now we're talking about Peter, upon whom Mark relied. The second century church agreed that it was Mark who wrote the second gospel based on information supplied by Peter. And some of the leading writers of the second century, it's a shared view papyrus, writing in about AD 130, all right, Justin, Irenaeus, and Clement. There's general agreement that Mark was supplied his information by Peter, who was one of the inner three. And so Mark is writing is writing an account based on one of those guys who, look man, he was there. He walked with Jesus. He got rebuked by Jesus too. You know? Get behind me, Satan, like, whoa. Alright, so Peter was kind of all up in there. And Jesus had to rebuke him about his unspiritual thinking at that point in time. Well, you just have to love Peter. I mean, he's often the first to speak, but there's so many things we can learn from him. So Mark's account is very much based on Peter's, all right, on Peter's account and information from Peter. Peter himself says, Peter is giving this speech in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. And he's saying to the Jews gathered, in Jerusalem from all around, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Peter again speaking in Acts chapter 3, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. Peter himself in his first letter, all right, as an elder, to the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who will also share in the glory to be revealed. So Peter's speaking with some credibility here, because he's speaking as one who was an eyewitness. Mark's gospel gives so much of what he would have received from Peter. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, the differences in John as compared to Mark and the other two synoptics. And this was one of the issues I raised in answer to Kiara. The different objectives for writing. Alright, and I mentioned the higher Christology. That was evident in John, because a big part of his focus was for people to believe that Jesus was the Christ. Alright, and so I mentioned the I am statements and stuff like that. Just interestingly, and Paula, I want to dig so much deeper. I mean, I'm not a Greek scholar, but I just found this very interesting in my research, that in the synoptics, you don't really get, now, the I am statements. What's the significance of the I am statements in terms of Jesus' deity? Why did he get such a, well, first of all, what kind of response did Jesus get sometimes when he said these I am statements? Yes, I'm Ed.
Like he was being, what's that word?
Blasphemous?
Yes, that's the word. Yeah, blasphemous. Because when Moses went to go free the Israelites from Pharaoh, he asked God, who shall I tell them to send me? He told him this I am.
The I am sent me, right in Exodus chapter 3. Okay? Similarly, John chapter 8, Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. And I mean, it was like, if you see the reaction. Okay? So when Jesus said, I am, there was special significance to that, because you go back to that Exodus reference. And in a very veiled manner, Jesus was saying, hey, I am equal to God. One author has said that when we read the accounts of Jesus walking on water in Matthew and in Mark, what we actually get in most of our translations is Jesus saying, fear not, it is I. But that particular author said we may have missed the literal Greek, in which it's better read to say, fear not, I am. Now, it seems to be the only reference in the synoptics to something like that. I am at a disadvantage not being a student of the Greek language, but it's noteworthy that maybe even in the synoptics there's just kind of very hidden there. You know, fear not, I am, which will kind of connect us back to John 8 and connect us to Exodus chapter 3. So just a little side note there, you could probably go and do a little extra reading on it. I just found it quite interesting. So we spoke about Mark and John. John as a witness, Mark being supplied with his information from Peter as a witness. Luke chapter 1 and verses 1 to 4. Many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Barnett helps he draws some inferences from that passage. Number one, based on what Luke said in those early verses of chapter 1, certain eyewitnesses actually compiled narratives about Jesus. You can also infer from that passage in Luke 1 that these narratives were actually passed on to Luke, who himself was not an eyewitness. And there's agreement amongst the 2nd century writers that Luke was not an eyewitness. Using these, Luke has written up a more comprehensive history. So where Luke is concerned, he is saying that I am aware that there were eyewitnesses who wrote narratives about Jesus. And those narratives were passed on to me. And then with the information I have, I am now able to write a very detailed account. And Luke has been commended, and you will see a slide, as being a phenomenal historian in terms of the language that he uses. And just by the way, though I'm not a scholar of the Greek language, the Greek of Luke and the Greek of Hebrews are particularly impressive. All right, if any of you end up becoming students of the Greek language, seems as though the quality of Greek used in Luke Acts, because it's a 2-volume book, and Hebrews are very, very impressive. So Luke was a physician, you know, all right, and obviously quite a good historian as well. In the same way that we learned about textual criticism, there's also a science called the source criticism. All right, and source critics see 3 threads in Matthew. All right, so we're looking at Luke and Matthew now, having concentrated on Mark and John earlier. Mark's gospel, 90% of Mark is found in Matthew, which represents about 50% of Matthew. I hope that hasn't confused you. So Mark has 16 chapters. I mean, the chapters and chapter numbers aren't inspired or anything like that. But most of those 16 chapters that we have, Matthew has repeated. But when you put it in Matthew, it accounts for about half of Matthew. You follow that? Yeah? The source Q that I mentioned earlier, all right, constitutes about a quarter of Matthew. And then there's another source referred to as M, all right, material that is found in Matthew alone, which is another 25% of Matthew. So what you have in Matthew is a large chunk of Mark, taking up about 50% of it. Then you have some from Q and some from M. One of the questions that is asked, and I'd love to get your thoughts here, it's a pretty searching question in my view. As one of the 12, okay, Matthew was one of the 12, who obviously trained by Jesus and, you know, in his ministry, various things like that. As one of the 12, Matthew was an eyewitness, so why borrow from Mark? Yeah? I'm seeing a hand on the back. What's the name? Kurt. Kurt. Yes, Kurt. What's your thought?
The fact that you said earlier that Mark seems to have gotten a lot of this information here. So Matthew wouldn't take the account closest that Christ would draw from Peter, who was closest to Christ.
What do you guys think about that? Absolutely agree. But I shouldn't have said that yet. Let's get some other thoughts. But did everyone heard that? Good. Just say it again loudly for everyone to hear.
Sorry, I have a little bit of a technical crash.
Oh, sorry.
You said earlier that Mark drew a lot of his information directly from Peter.
Yeah.
So if Matthew wanted to write the closest to his accurate account that he could, he draws from the information that came from Peter.
Yeah.
Because Peter was closest
To Jesus. Okay. Any other thoughts? I saw a couple hands go up. What's the name?
Ariel.
Ariel. Yes.
I think most in scholarly writing, like writers will use source materials from other scholars as supporting evidence, and that lends credence to what they're saying. And so if he, as a tax collector and probably somewhat educated, was aware of that practice, maybe was using that to lend credibility to what he was writing as well.
I haven't thought about it. I think that's reasonable. Name?
Jessica.
Yes, Jessica.
It says in the end of John that Jesus did many other things. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room for the books that would be written. And I think that I naturally, as a woman, I feel lots of things, but sometimes I need guidance, like somebody to imitate. So maybe he just needs some guidance to figure out what was the most important.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Appreciate the comments. I saw a hand up in the back. Yes. What name? Sorry.
My name is Angel.
Angel. Yes.
He was an eyewitness, and Mark was first. He definitely read Mark, and he was definitely reliable enough, and he had all the information to say that what Mark was saying was true. And he said, if I read the book, I was there. What he's saying is true. I can use it.
Okay.
That's a simple.
Okay. So he's saying, as an eyewitness, I can actually verify the things that I've read in Mark. So I'm confident enough, inspired by the Spirit, to note it. Okay. Useful. Yes. Let's take a couple more. Gray jersey down in the back, and then the sister in the kind of burnt orange. Yes. What's the name? Yeah.
Courtney.
Yes, Courtney. Right. You answered it. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, I've heard that. I mean, Matthew is Jewish, and so he like a lot of the things that he references compared to the other Gospels, he doubles. And so
Yes.
it's like true of some things, where there's some things in other Gospels, because in Jewish law, like you needed two witnesses
Yeah.
to condemn somebody or kind of like make somebody guilty.
Yeah.
And so whenever he borrows from Mark, he's almost like enhancing his credibility,
Yeah.
saying that he has Mark and himself as he himself.
It's an interesting point. And what Courtney raised there, I mean, we don't have time to get into it now. It helps to resolve discrepancies in the Gospels, but sometimes it's complicated. And I think even for us, we have to kind of sit down and breathe a little bit deeply. There are tools called selection, adaptivity, and arrangement that the Gospel writers used. And that's one of them where, yeah, the doubling, all right, of the stories for the purpose of the audience was something that was done, and the Spirit allowed it. And that's one of the things we have to wrestle with. The Spirit of God allowed that. All right, selection, adaptivity, and arrangement. We can't get into that now, but just to say that some of those tools did exist. Let's just take two more. Burnt orange. Yes. What's your name? Oh, you okay? All right. And there was one more. I'm not seeing the hand again. Okay, fair enough. My thought, and it has been suggested as well, where we started off with Kurt, is that though Matthew was an eyewitness, because he was in a position to get a source that was even closer to Jesus because of what Mark received from Peter. It's one of the reasons why, though he was an eyewitness himself, he wanted to, okay, I saw certain things, but you know what? Peter got to have discipling times with Jesus, and they got to talk about issues that I didn't get to talk about, because I followed him from a distance. So maybe there's some things that came up in DP time that, you understand where I'm going with that. And I think it's also very reasonable. But be prepared for the question. People may very well ask the question. I'm not in any way saying that I have the exact answer for it, but we want to be able to think through what is fair and what is reasonable as we try to think through, the Spirit-inspired process and what was Mark's thinking. So in summary, where the Gospels are concerned as evidence, we have Matthew as an eyewitness, all right, and using a good book of Mark. We have Mark, who collaborated with Peter, himself an eyewitness. We have Luke, who built a solid account based on what he received from eyewitnesses. And then we have John also, an eyewitness. So when we look at what we have in the Gospels, we have, in my view, and I'm putting this down not as an assertion, but as an argument, that the Gospel writers are incredibly reliable sources for the life of Jesus. The main thread being, these guys wrote from the perspective of eyewitnesses. There's a question? Yes, remind me of the name?
Mitch.
Yes, Mitch.
So in the debate that we were to watch between, I guess, going against the evidence for resurrection, the opposing party posed the fact per se in Acts 4:13, talking about how Peter and John were unschooled, ordinary men. You know, a lot of these were fishermen, and claims, you know, they were not going to have written such things like this. Is that credible?
But I don't want to preempt Paulo's discussion. I'm not convinced that a lot of weight could have been given to it, whether it might have been a red herring or something. Now, in my own view, when he raised the question, now there's a good point that he raised, and then I thought, yeah, you've raised a good point, but the way how you've addressed it, I don't think is satisfactory. He raised the point that the best evidence that a historian wants is a contemporary account. Okay? Somebody who was actually there. And he says because of the dating of the Gospels, they're not reliable sources. But when I look at this, the sources are eyewitness sources. Yeah? So first and foremost, the fact that they were eyewitness sources, to me, adds a whole lot of credibility and a whole lot of weight to what they've said. I am not too sure the issue of the dating really should be connected to the fact that what these guys wrote were written from the perspective of eyewitnesses. So my own personal view was, that's a great point. You know what? Historians, the best sources that they want are contemporary, but what he was trying to imply is that in the absence of a contemporary source, your other sources can't be reliable. That was what he was implying. And my viewpoint is no. While that may be your best sources, you can still have very reliable sources that aren't contemporary. All right? And I'm sure we will discuss it further, Power. I think it may come up depending in the debate. You have a follow-up question?
I guess it sounded like he was implying that they couldn't even have written it at all. Like, you know,
in terms of in terms of their educational ability and stuff, he did mention that, and given the fact that Luke, for instance, I myself even said was written in highly impressive Greek, etc. Again, I didn't give a whole lot of thought to it because I just simply thought the inspiration process and the work of the Holy Spirit is something that you can't try to rationalize with human thinking. Well, you weren't educated, so that means you can't write an educational account. The earlier than the Gospels. Alright, we spoke about the dating of Galatians. This represents a gap of, let's give it about 15 or so years. If you're taking the crucifixion to be about 30 or so, give or take a couple of years, you know, and the Jesus' death and resurrection. Alright, maybe about, Paul is writing Galatians maybe about 15 years or so afterwards. I would ask a question now. I don't know how many of you were alive in 1998. Many of you might have been very young. How old? That's 15 years ago. So some people here might have been very young. Anybody here can remember a major event that happened in 1998? Maybe some of the older ones among us. Yes, what's the name?
I believe the Broncos won Super Bowl.
Who's that? Who won the Super Bowl? The Broncos, then from Denver. Okay. That's good. I mean, my analogy is from the world of sports as well. Anybody else remembers from 1998? Could you say it again? Sorry? Mad cow disease. That's when it first came out? Okay. Wow. Thanks. All the way in the back? The Olympics? No. Well, the closest, no, we had the Atlanta Olympics in '96. and the Sydney Olympics in 2000. Athens was 2004. But there was another major event. Well, from the Caribbean, we play soccer, football a lot, and the World Cup was held in France in 1998, and it was won by France in 1998. Now, the context for the US, that was actually 4 years after the US hosted the World Cup, and that was in 1994. And then for me, this is a heartbreaker. In 1990, the soccer World Cup was in Italy, and in 1989 there was some qualifiers that were going on, and there was room for one more team from CONCACAF, the Caribbean region, and 2 teams were trying to get into the World Cup. One team was Trinidad and Tobago, and the other team was the United States of America. The USA needed to win the game to qualify for the World Cup. Trinidad and Tobago needed to just tie the game to qualify for the World Cup. Let's just say I was crying afterwards. Because the USA won 1-0. And 25,000 of us in the stadium in Trinidad were crying. America beat us. I can't believe America doesn't play soccer. It was tough. So you see, I remember very clearly. But the point I'm trying to make, if you were alive in 1998, 15 years ago, and some loose rumor started, you could actually contradict and say, no, that's a lie. I was alive. You're around long enough to be able to say, no, I was alive in 1998. That story that is circulated did not happen. So let's just say it was the Broncos who won the Super Bowl. And somebody said, look man, the Miami Dolphins won the Super Bowl in 1998. The fans from Denver would say, hello, no, my team won. Okay? It would be, for us, it would be like if somebody said, the President of the United States in 1998 was Barack Obama. We'd be like, please. No, the President of the United States now is Barack Obama. He's now beginning his 2nd term. All right, the US presidents only get 2 terms. So what are you talking about? You know what I mean? So the point being that with such a short gap between the events surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection and when Paul's earliest letters were written, if the things that Paul was putting into writing were fiction or legend, people would have been alive to be able to say, Paul, you are speaking nonsense. You with me? Yeah. And that's why that proximity really matters. So even when people talk about, well, look at the distance, look man, 15 years is very, very short in terms of history, first and foremost. But that issue of proximity is very significant because people could stop and say, I was around. So what is being circulated, that's legend, that's myth, that's fiction. I was around. Paul would not have been able to get away with it simply because people would have been around who were there at the time to say, no man, where did Paul get this from? All right, I'm sure we'll make a note of it, quoting Boyd. He said, the closer the proximity to the event, the less chance there is for legendary development, for error, or for memories to get confused. Is there anything earlier than Paul's letters? Well, there were creeds, all right, statements of belief, confessions of faith, hymns from the early church. These were things that were actually in existence. Remember I said earlier this morning that there was very much an oral culture. So some of these creeds existed, all right? Let me see who may be familiar. These are some familiar passages. Anybody know what Philippians 2:6-11 is talking about? Don't look at the Bibles, please.
Imitate Christ's humility.
Imitating Christ's humility. Very good. Colossians 1:15-20.
He's the firstborn.
He was the firstborn, the supremacy of Christ. Good stuff. 1 Corinthians 15:3-7.
Is it about how, since we know that Jesus rose from the dead, like we pray for these people when they're dead?
That's correct. All right, the post-resurrection appearances. Good stuff, guys. All right, these were some of the well-known creeds circulating in the early church. And what we would do is actually look at the one in 1 Corinthians because it allows us to move smoothly into the discussion of the resurrection. Now, let me just ask a question here. I think, now it all depends on the guys here. because now we're pretty much scheduled for a break. But I might be able to go through maybe in another 15 minutes and we just take the one break at about 3:15 or so. I don't know what's best. If we should just... Yes. All right. Okay, so let's just go through. Yeah? Yeah, let's go ahead and proceed then. Thanks. All right, so look at what the passage says. And this Paul put into writing in 1 Corinthians. All right, what had been circulating orally as a creed amongst the early church, within the early church. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. That Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still sleeping, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to the apostles, and later on in verse 8 he says he appeared to me as one abnormally born. Let's focus on verse 3. For what I received, I passed on to you. What is Paul talking about? Jesus' crucifixion again, about AD 30, Paul's conversion about 32 AD. Galatians 1:18, which is the next slide, talks about the fact that then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, who's Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. So I go back one slide. According to Galatians 1:18, it seems as though maybe about 3 or so years after Paul's conversion, he went to Jerusalem and he met with the apostles. It might have been Peter and James in particular. And it seems as though on that journey to Jerusalem, he received this 1 Corinthians 15 creed, all right, which was in circulation, had already been formulated, was being utilized by the early church. And Paul actually included that in his penning of 1 Corinthians. So Shaw makes the observation, quoting another scholar, Craig Blomberg. Now here you have the key facts about Jesus' death for our sins, plus a detailed list of those to whom he appeared in resurrected form, all dating back to within 2 to 5 years of the events themselves. And that's significant again in terms of history, in terms of time. Crucifixion about the year 30 AD. And just a couple of years later, there's a solid belief within the early church about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And then, we have it reduced into writing later on in Corinthians. Strobel is quoting Blomberg and saying a good case can be made for the saying that Christian belief in the resurrection, though not yet written down, can be dated to within 2 years of that very event. Alright, so within 2 years, just 2 years or so after the resurrection took place, within early Christian circles, this was a solid creed. This was something that was believed in. And Paul received that, it seems, when he went to Jerusalem as maybe a 3-year-old disciple. And, we see it recorded in 1 Corinthians. Luke makes an interesting observation in the beginning of Acts, where he says after his suffering, he presented himself to them. And Jesus himself gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. All right, Jesus himself. We have the eyewitnesses, we have Jesus giving many convincing proofs. Okay, no objections to the break, so we move on. Great. All right, the New Testament is on point. All right? Huh? It's on point. All right. William Lane Craig, one of the brothers here has a book called Reasonable Faith. Who is it? One of the brothers here has a book called Reasonable Faith from William Lane Craig. Okay, yeah. All right. All right. So the same guy, he's written quite a lot of stuff on apologetics, etc. And Craig is saying if we want any details about Jesus' life and teachings, we must turn to the New Testament. Extra biblical sources outside of the Bible confirm what we read in the Gospels. I mean, the scholars are just convinced, look man, the Gospels, the New Testament as a whole, it's reliable. And when we go outside of it, what the extra biblical sources do, they confirm what we read in the Gospels. They don't tell us anything new. And then, so the question has to be, how historically reliable are the New Testament documents? We went through quite a bit of that earlier on today. All right, F.F. Bruce asks a similar question. And he says, look, the reliability of the writings which purport to record the record of Christianity is a question of first-rate importance. Another scholar says we can have great confidence in the fidelity with which this material has come down to us, especially compared with other ancient literary work. Geisler, Nix, I love their language. The New Testament then has not only survived in more manuscripts than any other book from antiquity, we saw that earlier, but it has survived in a purer form than any other great book, a form that is 99.5% pure. All right? Again, the faith and reliability of the New Testament as a whole, as a historical document. Even archaeology confirms this issue of reliability, all right, because we spoke about the John 18 fragment found about 125 AD. By demonstrating that copies of John existed this early and as far away as Egypt, archaeology has effectively dismantled, demolished, all right, speculation that John had been composed well into the 2nd century, too long after Jesus' life to be reliable. Somebody's trying to make the point, man, John was actually written in the 2nd century. It was too far removed from Jesus. Archaeology is saying, no, John was a whole lot earlier than that. Corroborating evidence, corroborate. Webster's dictionary says that means to make more certain or to confirm. All right? What is this evidence dealing with? Whether ancient historians confirm or contradict the New Testament's claims about Jesus' life, teachings, and miracles. So now, we're stepping outside of the New Testament documents and we're looking at history. All right? Non-Christian sources. The New Testament writers themselves are the best reason for believing about the existence of Jesus. However, there's other early information about Jesus written by non-Christians. These non-Christian sources fall into two broad classes, all right? Roman and Jewish. Roman sources, Pliny the Younger. He had an uncle called Pliny the Elder. All right, I wonder what his father's name was. I don't know. I just found it very interesting. Pliny the Younger, nephew of Pliny the Elder. So maybe daddy wasn't around, I don't know. Tacitus and Suetonius, some of the leading Jewish sources. Josephus, Rabbi Eliezer, the Benediction 12. I mean, you can do your own reading and stuff on some of these. I'm going to concentrate on maybe three of the more well-known ones. Pliny, Tacitus, and Josephus. All right, Pliny was a Roman, nephew of Pliny the Elder. And he was, I believe, the governor of Bithynia around this period, 110 to 112 AD. Pliny complained to his Emperor Trajan. All right? In Bithynia, he wrote about, check this out, a movement involving many of all ages and every rank and also of both sexes. He further lamented the effect on not the cities only, but also the villages and the countries. Pliny in the 2nd century is complaining. And he's saying there are a whole bunch of these people all over the place. And they're spreading. It's men, it's women, it's young, it's old. They're in the country, they're in the villages. You know who he was talking about? The Christians. And he's writing to the Emperor Trajan to say, look man, this thing is spreading like a disease all over the place. And Barnett is saying, look man, based on what Pliny wrote, there can be no doubt about the existence in about 110 AD, early 2nd century, of a substantial body of Christians in remote Bithynia. This is a fact of history. By early 2nd century, all right, it's historical record. Pliny's like, it's a whole bunch of these people, man. You know? It reminds me of, there's a passage in Acts, I believe, where it says that these people are turning the world upside down. You know? Colossians talks about, you know, the gospel bearing fruit all over the world. You know what I mean? So, as you get into the early 2nd century, it's like everywhere I look, I see one of them. That kind of thing. That's a good problem. All right, moving on to Tacitus. One of his works was something called the Annals. Tacitus explicitly stated that Nero persecuted the Christians as scapegoats after there was a fire in 64 AD. All right, that devastated Rome. You know, the majority of Rome was devastated by the fire, and Nero blamed the Christians. All right, he was the Roman Caesar at that time, and it's recorded in history. All right, by Tacitus, that yeah, boy, you know, the Christians were made scapegoats. for this fire. There's even a suggestion that in 1 Peter 1, when Peter talks about your faith being refined by fire, that it might have been a play on words referring to this particular event. It's just a discussion that has come. It's quite possible. All right, but Tacitus records as a historical fact that this thing did take place. That the Christians were blamed for a fire that they didn't cause. Josephus, he was born, all right, just around the time of Jesus' death, etc. And just afterwards. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jews in the late 1st century. He lived through the Jewish-Roman War. And during this Jewish-Roman War, we may be familiar with the fact that the temple got razed to the ground, razed as an R-A-Z-E, to the ground, totally destroyed in 70 AD. Jesus actually predicts that in Matthew 24. Alright, so the Jewish-Roman War was something that Josephus lived through. He was a Pharisee, he was a priest. And he was disliked by the Jews, but actually popular amongst the Christians. And in the Antiquities, look at what Josephus wrote. He convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. And certain others, he accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. So Josephus in his early writings is actually naming someone called James and referring to James as the brother of Jesus. Did Jesus have a brother called James? Yes, he did. Alright? Half brother. I think technically I guess it's his half brother. That's what I'm going to say, it's his half brother. Alright? Back then I think they used to like, well, that's my half brother, that's my, you know that expression, right? Okay. And Jesus is referred to as Jesus who was called the Christ. So here's a historical document referring to James as the brother of Jesus and referring to Jesus as one called the Christ. Now this one is a little bit more in dispute. Alright, something called the testimonium flavor. That was George and Ed, alright? Flavianum. Now, what's it? There's discussion about this. Now, here's what it says. Alright, it's an English translation, and they're varying translations of the English, but for the most part say the same thing. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day. As the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, why I say this is disputable, there is tremendous discussion as to the authenticity of this and whether you can believe the contents. Alright, and this is from book 18 of the Antiquities. Yamauchi observes, today there's been remarkable consensus among both Jewish and Christian scholars that the passage as a whole is authentic, although there may be some interpolations. Anybody know what an interpolation is? Yes, William? That's right, it's something that's inserted. So Yamauchi says, look man, I need to confess. A lot of people believe, and I probably believe too, yeah, they got some interpolations there. There's some things that are kind of thrown in there to kind of make my point. Alright, so that is admitted. But what he's saying is that in spite of the couple of interpolations that may be there, the general agreement between even Jewish and Christian scholars is that as a whole, the passage is authentic, so that you can give a reasonable amount of weight to this being an authentic passage from a document penned by Josephus. He says, you know what, even with these interpolations, Josephus corroborates important information about Jesus. There are some other sources, like I said, there are quite a few people like Thallus, Phlegon, Julius Africanus, and the books of the Apostolic Fathers, especially the 7 letters of Ignatius. So other scholars are there. We have, Yamaji says, better historical documentation for Jesus than for the founder of any other ancient religion. We looked at some of this a little bit earlier on, Zoroaster, the Buddha, Muhammad. All right, by comparison, the historical documentation for Christ way outdoes all of the others. All right, so in terms of corroborating evidence, the Roman sources, the Jewish sources, Paul's letters are sometimes seen as corroboration for the gospel accounts, the letters of the Apostolic Fathers. So we're moving to a close here. Archaeological evidence or scientific archaeology dealing with coins, documents, architecture, etc., etc. Great book written by Craig Evans, Jesus and His Word. All right, very recent publication, in fact. Evans notes the writings of the Bible speak of real people, real places, real events. And this is what archaeology helps with. Many of these things can be corroborated by archaeological discoveries and by other ancient sources. I appreciate this comment. The function, usefulness, and limitations of archaeological evidence are well summarized by Dr. John McCree. He says, if we dig in Israel and we find ancient sites that are consistent with where the Bible said we find them, that shows that its history and its geography are accurate. However, it doesn't confirm that what Jesus Christ said is right. Spiritual truths cannot be proved or disproved by archaeological discoveries. You understand the point that's being made? Somebody share with me. Just put it in your own words for me. Maybe just a couple comments. Anybody just wants to... But what's the point that he's making here about maybe the limitations of archaeology? I shouldn't be forgetting your name by now. Matt. Michael. Yes, Michael.
Stuff that you find in the ground can't prove theology.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So stuff you find on the ground can't prove theology. Ed?
Just because Jesus was here doesn't mean that he was the Son of God.
Yeah, and you can't use archaeology to prove that. All right. So archaeology, we have to understand the limitations of its usefulness. It's a great point. Archaeology will help us see something. The Bible says particular things, and then archaeology cannot confirm. So what it does, it helps you to see that the history and the geography of the Bible is accurate, but you can't use that to confirm a spiritual truth. Yeah? So we understand what archaeology can be used for, but we also understand what it cannot be used for, and that's fair. Luke's attention to historical and geographical details are noteworthy. McCrae adds the general consensus of both liberal and conservative scholars, even those who, may not be as conservative, they stop and say, look man, Luke is a very accurate historian. Archaeological discoveries are showing over and over again that Luke is accurate in what he has to say. The scholars are, look man, Luke was, he was accurate, he knew what he was talking about. Alright? Let's look at a couple of the archaeological finds. Luke 3:1 mentions that in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, while Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius the tetrarch of Abilene. Isn't there a university or college called Abilene? There is. Yeah, the name sounded familiar when I looked at it. What's the archaeological find? An inscription was found from the time of Tiberius Caesar, who ruled within that period, 14 to 37 AD, which actually names Licinius as tetrarch of Abila, near Damascus, and Abila is actually the capital city of this Roman district of Abilene. So here's one archaeological find which confirms that the history and the geography recorded in Luke was on target. Geisler, teaming up with a different author, wrote a book called When Critics Ask. And the observation is that, hey, one prominent archaeologist carefully examined Luke's references. Check this out with Luke. You go to the book of Luke, look at 32 countries, 52 cities, 9 islands. I don't know if Trinidad and Tobago made it there. Finding not a single mistake. All right, in terms of Luke's attention to history and geography. So when they do a close examination of all of these references, not a single mistake. That's just powerful. Okay? Couple others nowadays in Jerusalem. This is John 5 verse 2. Near the sheep gate, a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Alright, other translations say Bethsaida, others Bethzatha. Was the archaeological find within recent times? The pool of Bethesda has been excavated, and what we found 5 porticos, which are colonnaded porches or walkways. The pool lies about 40 feet below the ground. Archaeological discovery of this pool of Bethesda confirming what is found, what we read in John chapter 5. There are others from John, Jacob's well, the pool of Siloam, the stone pavement near the Jaffa Gate. Archaeology, and it just continues to evolve. The Australian archaeologist says those who know the facts now recognize that the New Testament must be accepted as a remarkably accurate source book. So, what is my argument? Because I've moved it beyond an assertion that the case for the existence of Christ has been well built. The evidence is cogent and compelling. The Gospels are reliable and accurate sources for the life and claims of Jesus, and their content is firmly corroborated by both biblical and extra-biblical sources. History confirms the truth of the scriptures about the God-man called Jesus. That's it. We have just about 10 minutes because we have a break scheduled for 3:15. All right, that'll be a 15-minute break and we'll come back together for parallel sessions. Let's have some either questions, comments, discussions. I should not be forgetting your name. Mitch. Yes, Mitch?
So it's kind of going back to kind of being where we started this morning about the text and where it's coming from and the changing of words. I live in West Philly and there's a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I get a lot of this, they've taken the word Jehovah out of the Bible, and so they say that the God that I pray to is not their God, and the Bible I read is not their God, and they say that Yeshua and a lot of these things were removed for purposes which I'm not sure. I'm wondering if those type of things were calculated when it came to those different kind of adage or whatever, or
well, there are a couple of issues I think you've raised there. One of them is the various names by which God was called. That in and of itself is